Yeah, so we're going to be talking about museums and communities, museums and your communities in the Earth crisis. And the plan is this brief introduction, then a warm-up creative task to introduce yourself and your museum. We're going to do a quick presentation on what is the Earth crisis, then an activity where we ask you to map the impacts of the Earth crisis on your colleagues and organisation and your community. Then we're going to do another presentation where we introduce some key concepts or tools for change. Then there'll be a group activity where we put you into breakout groups, and hopefully there'll be more people then. If not, we'll just stay in one group. And it will be exploring how we might put an eco lens on your collections. And I hope you might have come prepared with an object or a set of things or a site ready to think about. And that will then lead us into a concluding discussion on how you might plan for regenerative change for and with communities. But this is an introductory session, so in the 2 hours available, we can't hope to, save the world and create, the perfect museum environment to do so. But it's really about getting the key concepts and tools for how you might start that. So I'll quickly describe who we are. So I'm Bridget Mackenzie. My background is museum learning, and I was working at in national museums for some years running learning programs, but I then found that I was a bit of a maverick and an experimenter. So I left and set up an agency called Flow Associates. We're audience researchers and evaluators. And then 2 years ago, I thought I really want to create a museum, a creative organization that really engages with climate and ecology, because there isn't another climate museum in the country. So we're a mobile digital museum. We run pop-ups when we can, but for the last year, we've been quite online, stirring and collecting responses to the climate and ecological emergency. We're a team of creative people, including Victoria, who will introduce herself in a minute, based in the UK. We produce and make and collect art, objects, ideas, games, books, and then we use them in activations that help people play, make, think and talk about the Earth crisis and open their imaginations to possible futures. Victoria, this slide doesn't sum you up entirely, but you could use this to introduce yourself.
Hi everybody, good morning. So yes, I'm Victoria Burns and I work with Bridget at Climate Museum. I have a history of working in the cultural sector, supporting organisations with organisational development and change, and more recently that's included changes around social and environmental justice. And I am also a coaching psychologist, and I'm currently at Birkbeck researching how coaching can support social change, social justice change. I'm also the National Coordinator for Culture Declares a Climate and Ecological Emergency, which currently have around over 1,500 declaring organisations and individuals. So that would be worth checking out if you're interested in. I'd be very happy to talk to anyone thinking of making a declaration. So that's me really.
So we just wanted to kind of start with an optimistic note. So it is a profoundly troubling subject, the Earth crisis, but it's known that if people begin any activity or any experience with positive facts, with a sense of can do, then they will go on to explore those more difficult facts with more preparation, a greater sense of optimism. So we just wanted to kind of start off by, being aware of the amazing ingenuity of humanity, that we have amazing brains and that we now have the technology to be able to achieve so much, including seeing into people's brains. And in a way, museums offer the the platform for all of that human ingenuity to be explored and shared and generated more in the future. So we just wanted to kind of begin with that optimism bomb. So moving on to the creative warm-up. So Victoria.
Yeah, so this is your opportunity to introduce yourselves. So what we'd like you to do is to think about, imagine the world in 10 years' time, that it's made up of systems that are sustaining people, places and planet, and draw a shape that might convey that, or you feel might represent that. Bridget, do you wanted to say something about the research around the shapes?
Yeah, so the reason we asked you to do this is there's the Post Growth Institute. I don't know if you've heard of them. They're really leading on research and investigation into how we can move into a society where we're not obsessed with constant growth, constant extraction, and then constant economic growth, and how to enable people still to be well in that kind of system. And they do an exercise, and they've done it thousands of times, where they ask people to draw a system in the future in 10 years' time, and then to come back to the present day and to draw the shape of it now. And without fail, the future is always a circle, a spiral, and the current system is always presented as some kind of jaggy, triangular kind of mess, or just something very messy. So really, that's kind of that kind of inspires our session today, really, sort of helping you shift from the current really messy situation with, all this kind of like big system of intersecting difficulties and uncertain outcomes, to try to move into a plan for a future that is both more kind of peaceful and calm and bit more in control, but also more regenerative and circular. So I'm just going to share my screen again and talk through this question of what is the Earth crisis. So I guess we can record again. So we start with a quote from Antonio Guterres, who is the Secretary General of the UN. He says, "Humanity is waging war on nature. This is suicidal. Nature always strikes back, and it's already doing so with growing force and fury. Biodiversity is collapsing. 1 million species are at risk of extinction. Ecosystems are disappearing before our eyes. But human activities are at the root of our descent towards chaos, but that means human action can help to solve it." So this is that kind of paradox at the heart of it, that human industrial activities have created this mess, but human ingenuity and action can help solve it. So just a little bit more about the causes of this mess. So the climate emergency is, that phrase is quite often used, but we tend to use the phrase climate and ecological emergency. And for short, I use the phrase Earth crisis. And it's really important to understand the intersection of the histories, long histories of ecological damage due to human activities, and then the kind of current situation we're in, where now climate is the biggest breached planetary boundary. But for many centuries, humans have been chopping down wood for fire, for their infrastructure, and increasingly in the last 100 years, they've not been replenishing those forests. So, and this is really even ramping up now particularly in the Amazon and across Africa. But forests are vital to Earth's climate. Then there's the tricky subject of population growth. Quite a lot of people in the kind of climate world tend to avoid talking about population, but and it is something to address very sensitively. But you can see there on the right that the massive increase in population in the last 70 years and projected to increase in the immediate future. And, you know, more people means more consumption of resources. And then, you know, the whole sort of infrastructure of industrial civilization, for example, cars and road transport, has had a huge impact. And you can see from this image that that this is very unequally distributed. And this is a really key factor, that when talking, for example, about population, you also need to balance that with understanding the inequality of the consumption of resources. So there's the USA on the left there with their gigantic SUVs all over the place. So road transport, of course, is reliant mostly on burning fossil fuels. So burning fossil fuels is the major source of harm at the moment. And you can see again how unequally distributed this is across the globe, with the major emissions from China, from coal, but also from America and Russia. Europe is really on the way to reducing its emissions, but it still keeps on, you know, like in the UK, there's potential of a coal mine in Cumbria, you know, so we're not getting rid of this fossil fuel infrastructure, despite having known actually for 50 years that fossil fuels are causing serious, devastating harm. So yes, the fossil fuels industry is a really key thing to bear in mind when, you know, planning any kind of regenerative work. So thinking about how are the fossil fuels and then their kind of subsidiary supporting industries, how are they normalizing this world in which we consume plastic, consume fossil fuels? How are they gaining a social license to operate? And so the other thing to talk about is the food system. So the food system is absolutely significant. It isn't just about transport and energy. Food is absolutely core to what's caused this flow of harm over time that is getting worse because of climate change. So farming is causing damage to local and global ecosystems. I should say agribusiness, you know, big farming. It's causing soil depletion, biodiversity loss, and that in turn reduces the capacity of the land and oceans to act as a carbon sink. So farming and fishing, you know, fisheries are also, commercial fishing is also causing a lot of damage. And then that worsens climate change, and that reduces the food supply for the future. And then there's this flow of harm going the other way. Farming creates direct emissions, which affect the climate system, which cause, for example, forest fires and changing landscapes that damage ecosystems, that reduce the food supply. So food security and the rising food prices and lack of access to good nourishing food is a major problem worldwide, and it's probably going to start affecting the UK much more. We're already the most in Europe. UK has the most food inequality of almost any other country. And this diagram is a little bit overwhelming to look at, so don't try and read it all, but it's just really trying to illustrate the intersecting flow of impacts between ecocide and fossil fuels. And then, you know, the fossil fuel industries, if you see on the right, doing what's called predatory delay. So they're delaying climate action in order to continue profiting for as long as they can. And this is then leading to resource insecurity, mainly food insecurity, and disease. And this is a key point to make, that the that COVID-19 is part of the Earth crisis because it arises from deforestation and the wrong relationship with wild animals, essentially. And so that's led to zoonotic pandemics, including COVID-19. So essentially, at the root of it all is extractivism. So extractive capitalism in particular is has been undergoing this great acceleration, what we were talking about as, you know, this obsession with growth. And extraction began with, you know, the extraction or the use of forests and coal and oil, but it's just growing and growing so that people are now having their power, their rights, their heritage extracted. And so, you know, we really want to turn that pyramid over and ensure that people have full sort of liberty and access to their land, to their resources, to their rights. And, you know, it's interesting to think what museums can do to help with that kind of restoration. So a real kind of like a little creed, the climate emergency and the ecological emergency. Zoonotics are from the ecological emergency. When thinking about carbon footprint, always think more broadly about ecological footprint. We need to think about mitigating climate, but also because the Earth crisis is so complicated and there are so many unfolding impacts, we have to start adapting to those impacts. Protecting nature means regenerating nature. Social justice depends on environmental justice. So, for example, people need access to land and food. Extractive capitalism is racist and ecocidal. We suggest that you model change in your own realm and also catalyze and demand change beyond it. So this is a kind of key point about, you know, not just encouraging consumer action, but also, you know, citizenship and political action.
I think it's always really important to start with the local and the experiences of your audiences, and then draw out into the bigger, systemic or system awareness that comes from that. But yeah, it all has to start from sort of, from the heart and from the lived experience. It's such a huge and overwhelming issue. We sort of vacillate to feeling, it's awful and we can't do anything about it. So I'll stick my fingers. I think Bridget's going to come to those sort of emotions later on. But, action is a great kind of, not cure, but a way of approaching it in a kind of, if you feel you can do to make a difference. And I'll come back to that actually, I think, with ideas around sort of leadership. And if we see the whole thing as systemic, as a system, and we're all actors in it, then we all have agency, however small, and we're all leaders in our own way.
So, Victoria, do you want to explain what this is about?
So, this is actually, thinking about your contexts and acknowledging that your colleagues and your organisation and your communities are already being affected in different ways by the environmental, struggles the planet is experiencing. And it's not necessary, it's not a distant thing, it's things that are happening now. So if you can sort of think and discuss and share the impacts on your organisations and your communities. So thinking about them in terms of material impacts and also maybe emotional impacts.
Some of those diagrams that show the gigantic towers of, China and America is partly to make you feel not quite so guilty, and what Yvette said about reducing that sense of shame, that, maybe what you can do is really focus on education rather than worrying quite so much about the fact about how people have to get there or the materials they have to use. And perhaps also as one of the objects of this exercise is to kind of spread the empathy, you know, to use the empathy that you have for yourself and your colleagues to think about your audiences and the communities that perhaps are not your core audiences, but they could be, or that are that you could enable benefits for if you kind of spread your work out or contribute to some kind of system change through your work, working with others as well, working more collaboratively. So just quickly to share again, I just did this. It's a little bit maybe slightly overwhelming, but I wanted to try and create some kind of a simple map of trying to understand privilege and disadvantage, past and future, in relation to the climate and ecological emergency. So the kind of purpley blob is to do with global population. It's not actually very worked out, but my prediction is that the global population will actually decline eventually because of the Earth crisis. But so just kind of ignore that shape for now. What really matters here is these different sectors. So at the very top, the 10% richest people produce half of the world's emissions and are more likely to deny climate science and delay climate action. So they are actually probably a really key audience for engaging with. But also a very significant audience are I think probably the majority of museum visitors, which is middle classes, you know, who are, where there's a rise in anxiety about the future. They're looking ahead to the future. There's real concern about precarity for young people, and there's a rise in environmental activism. But because, you know, there's this increasing precarity in the middle class, there's a big blur between middle and working class. It's quite hard to distinguish these days. Massive growth in you know, kind of 0 hours, you know, contracts and unemployment. But then there's this key issue where white working class people might be more vulnerable to racist propaganda, and that does connect with climate change because it's actually the impacts of the Earth crisis and the extractive industries and countries that have led to a rise in migrants and refugees. And then there are people, you know, just intersectionally affected by disadvantage, people with disabilities or affected by prejudice such as homophobia, you know, who are, they may be extremely anxious about the future, but they also have immediate concerns to deal with in, you know, dealing every day with the big challenges. And then there's people historically impacted, you know, intersectionally impacted by racism, colonialism, displacement, conflict, who have who might experience a kind of ongoing lack of resources, of access to cultural capital, of a sense of political power. So, you know, this is a challenge for museums that you know, we need to be communicating with all of these different groups, but in different ways, and not pigeonholing people either. So yeah, empathizing with people as inequality is likely to widen, as more people of all groups fall into multiple disadvantage, but really trying to take action now to avoid that, the potential of that real dip in access to resources. I hope that made sense. It wasn't, I did that very last minute, so not particularly well explained. But I hope that was helpful.
We're just going to, I'm just going to whiz through some ideas around sort of concepts for change and different ways of kind of thinking about human sort of thought around, you know, living in the world, really. So some of these you might have encountered before, but essentially they're all sort of moves towards a new paradigm of human thinking. And traditionally paradigm shifts in thinking would take centuries, but the point is we're not afforded that time by the current ecological crisis. And I think when we go through these, and in this context, it might be interesting to consider how people lived in the past, perhaps how people lived in a greater harmony with nature, in a less exploitative one, and perhaps in a more kind of nature-based relationships with their environment. So basically, this is you know, talking through what a linear economy is, a circular economy, and really what we need to be aiming towards, which is a regenerative economy. So, I mean, it's pretty self-explanatory. We take, we make, we use, we waste. And that's all in the pursuit of, you know, growth economics. So the goal of that is to, you know, grow and grow and grow. And that's, you know, that's the only consideration. And then the circular economy, you know, pays attention to the fact that we can't, you know, we live in finite resources. So we take, we make, we use, we might recycle, reuse, repair, and return. And then we move towards a regenerative economy. I mean, and this bears in mind that we have already done immense damage to our environment, and you've probably come across the term Anthropocene. And that's not going to be undone. If we went to zero carbon tomorrow, we have, you know, we will still bear the costs of, you know, those greenhouse gases for generations. So it's not just about reusing, repairing, it's actually about growing and restoring. And restoring, I think, also gives attention to justice, really, and considering those who have not grown in the same way, you know, in the West, or the cultures that need to recover and be restored themselves, and you know, pay attention to more environmental and social justice issues. So to the next slide, and this is an example of you know, perfect example of regenerative design. So these bikes are smog filtering bikes. Not only do they serve the rider, they also clean the air for everyone, and they don't produce emissions. So, you know, win-win-win, really. And then the next, this is Kate Raworth's Doughnut economics. So this is an answer to linear growth economics, GDP, that the measures of success are how much we can sustain, use our resources. And there are 12 measures of success that we need to, in the middle of what we need to provide for everyone, without breaching our planetary boundaries. So if you get a chance, you know, she's great. It's great to have a look at that. And she's, you know, that these sort of models are gaining traction.
Yeah, the film 2040 is actually a great way into the Doughnut and other ideas, because it makes it very graphic and uses visuals and traveling to explain it.
Yeah, and on a local level, you know, people are developing local projects based on Kate Raworth's Doughnut economics. So that's also something to be interesting to consider for your local communities.
And we should mention that the Happy Museum project does quite a lot of support of museums to explore Doughnut and regenerative economics in their local communities. So there are plenty of resources there.
Yeah. Do you want to talk through this one, Bridget?
Oh, okay. So in Climate Museum UK, we're working closely with Culture Declares Emergency, with the idea that we're sort of collecting and amplifying the kinds of practice where culture takes action to bring about this safe and just space for humanity that the Doughnut model aims to create. So there are possibly 8 ways that cultural organizations can take action. So they can decarbonize their culture, their practices. They can look at decolonization. They can, like museums, can really make a contribution by truth telling through education and arts programming. They can support transition by their local communities in the way that I've just described that the Happy Museum project does. They can provide cultural therapy. So, for example, the Cultural Health and Wellbeing Alliance is giving awards for those kinds of work. And they can do ecological innovation and design, like we saw with the smog filtering bike. They can also, gather together for ambitious system changing global action. And this is the kind of work that Henry McGee is really supporting, with his training people in how to deliver the Sustainable Development Goals. And also just to point there to the need to adapt to the impacts of change. So it's like a sort of 8-part pathway. You could choose any or all of these pathways. And yeah, this one best.
Oh yeah, this is really raising a systemic awareness, which is sort of not thinking about the issues that affect your audiences and your institutions as separate but interconnected. So it's sort of open systems thinking that we've got very organizations think about themselves as closed systems. They don't think about themselves in terms of how they link with other systems and other the natural world, with ecology. So it's also thinking about ecologies and ecosystems within ecosystems. And really, I sort of showed this as a kind of to encourage you, really, because if the problems are systemic, then so are the solutions. And therefore, as networked actors or actants, you all have a place, and you can think, beyond your own institutions and organizations to think about where your own agency comes from and where you can pull from.
So I'm just going to quickly run through this really key concept of being Possitopian, which is our principle in Climate Museum. It's a word I invented, and it's not Positopian, about being positive about the future. It's about looking for the possible. So the possible is the biggest cone of the future. It's much bigger than what's probable or preferable. So we really want to encourage people to think with the most expanded possible, wide open, but also regenerative and fractal cone of the future. So in an Earth crisis, when there's more uncertainty to come, we also have to open our imaginations to the best of what's possible. And then finally, to just say a little bit about climate coping strategies. And there is a blog post there that you can read a bit more afterwards. So this comes from ecological psychology, and there's been quite a few studies to understand how people cope with trauma, and it actually comes from understanding people in conflict trauma. So there are these states, there are 5 states. The first one, and the most common, is denial. And this isn't just climate denial, it's also a kind of constructive denial. It's sort of, well, it won't affect me, or everything will be all right. And then there's the kind of emotional strategies that are about, maybe finding someone to talk to, expressing yourself, but it doesn't necessarily help you take action. And then there's the kind of logical rationalizing strategies that is actually quite common with kind of, in the kind of science world and with men particularly, maybe focusing on a particular kind of technical solution. Then even better is the meaningful strategy, where you're really understanding the systems and maybe being creative in your own life to take action. But the most effective is found to be when people are carrying out what's called prefigurative action. And this is essentially imagining the world that you want to create, or imagining the more regenerative, healthy systems that we need, and then being an activist for change and living it yourself. So just to give an example, so being activists for change might mean, subverting advertising to try to raise awareness of how the fossil fuel industries are seeking license to operate, while also inventing solutions that help us do without fossil fuels. So, for example, a young black man who invented this product of solar glass that is coloured and made more efficient using rotten fruit and veg. So it's a lovely kind of circular regenerative example. And people who are doing this kind of work are generally feeling better able to cope, essentially. So that really is our kind of goal, I think, of programming, to help people shift from those coping states into the more meaningful and prefigurative, taking action that will change the system, not just for themselves, but for others. So those were some key concepts. We're going to move now into more of an activity where you are thinking about your collections. And I hope that you might have come prepared with an item or maybe a thought about a set of items or a place. And this is about thinking with a more ecological and climate lens, and thinking about how you might interpret them, with the goal of enabling your visitors to shift from being in denial to raising their awareness and to helping them think, how can I actually take action? And I just quickly wanted to show a couple of things that we have in our collections. So our collections are actually distributed. We're a distributed museum, and it means that as practitioners, we're all creating our own collections. I'm not sure, Victoria, if you have many. You're not so much a collector.
No,
but I am surrounded by collections.
sorry.
What's that? Oh,
With my son did.
Oh, they're fantastic. Amazing. So yeah, there are 20 of us as associates, and we're all collecting, and we need a way to actually pool our collections and share what we have. But so yesterday I just acquired this, and I'll keep it in its box. It's Colgate has started making bamboo toothbrushes, which is quite interesting. I bought this from a sale. It's a toy set that normalizes fossil fuels. It's a service station set. Quite a lot of our things are actually things to play with. They're not collected for posterity. So quite a lot of things we are like getting old games and allowing them to be played with, or buying current, like this Carbon City Zero game. So you could acquire this, and we've been wanting to run climate games cafes. We also have a lot of books. And I just wanted to say that the images I used in that initial presentation are from this Climate Emergency Atlas, Dorling and Kindersley. So I should credit them. It's a really great new book. Anyway, so we have collections, some of which are already obviously already to do with climate and ecology, but others are kind of more open-ended. And in fact, really, the whole world is there for us to interpret. So, when we've run workshops, we've asked people to just pick 3 things around them on their desk and interpret them. So, your phone, your mug, your chair. Or just to say, a quick thing about putting an eco lens on things. There isn't just a single sort of green coloured eco lens. There are many ways of seeing things in a more climate and ecological way. So it might be that you're seeing from an animal's perspective, or that you're seeing from a zoomed out perspective, or you're looking in terms of deep time. But I don't want to tell you all of the kind of eco lenses that we've thought of. I want you to come up with your own. So yeah, how might you have a fresh take on these collections? Different ways of labeling, different ways of talking about them, arranging. Links to online or digital games. And we also have quite a few purchased and adapted games ourselves. And we could, in the future, potentially run a climate games training session. And also I would recommend a project called Climate Collage, which is a kind of workshop stroke game created out of the IPCC report, which sounds really dull, but it's trying to make climate science more accessible and visual. And they're planning to create a touring exhibition, and they're looking for a venue in London as a pilot venue for their touring exhibition. So there's some suggestions. Find out about ecological resources for activities, and I can try and find some for the end of the session. But actually we can provide a resource kit afterwards. We could take some of your questions and create a bit of a list of links and ideas. We use something called Eco Clay, which is made from paper, recycled paper. So it's very, very easy for little hands. It's dry, it's non-toxic, non-messy, and lovely bright colours. But they do come in little plastic bags, but